Alongside the ever-expanding and seemingly impossible to avoid influence of social media, there has been an observable uptick in violent extremism. As of 2025, 253 million social media users reside in the United States, which counts for 73% of the total US population. Concurrently, the evolving accessibility of social media coincides with a rise in political polarization, marking an extreme uptick in radicalization, violent extremism, and the erosion of democratic norms. On today's episode, we explore a question that has severe implications on the last 10 years of US politics. How does social media proliferate extremist values? We explore the notion that social media has a direct correlation with real-world extremist violence and influences the rate at which these acts of violence occur through the exploitation of social media as a weapon for spreading extremist values. We review some of the most significant examples of violent and nonviolent extremism in the United States over the last year, how social media may have played a part in their manifestation, and additionally, how a certain figurehead in right-wing extremist circles is on their way to becoming a household name by exploiting social media. My name is Madeline Cleaves, and this is Checks and Balances. Existing studies on the link between social media and extremist values point to social media as an essential recruitment tool. Some of the most recent data on this phenomenon comes from the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, which has reported that over half of some 500 political extremists cited social media as playing a primary or secondary role in their radicalization process between 2005 and 2016. When extremists weren't on social media or message boards, they often utilized other forms of digital media, such as videos and music, to pull the extra weight. Thus, it is evident that the internet in general is proficient in spreading radical beliefs. Following the first Trump administration, mainstream social media sites flip-flopped on their levels of content regulation and censorship. In 2020 and 2021, platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, now known as X, began to roll in stricter regulations on harmful content containing hate speech, extremism, and general misinformation. Post the 2021 January 6 Capitol riots, both Twitter and Facebook went so far as to indefinitely ban President Trump from their platforms, arguing that the president condoned rather than condemned the event, which many viewed as a large-scale act of political violence. 4 years later, both platforms have, for lack of a better term, returned to form, shifting away from censoring potentially sensitive or dangerous content, largely in the name of protecting free speech. While heavy censorship on any platform that hosts billions of users globally may not be the best strategy, as it may encourage effective polarization in the gatekeeping of information, the allowance of hateful content on a social media platform can also allow what would otherwise be fringe groups and lone actors to seep into the mainstream. Enter our first case study, Nick Fuentes. For a period of time, Nick Fuentes was only known by his relatively small following and individuals well-versed in the world of online political commentary. Nowadays, Fuentes has generated considerable buzz after being interviewed on the Tucker Carlson show to the tune of over 6 million views on YouTube. It is imperative to keep in mind that Fuentes isn't just some right-wing political commentator. He is a prolific anti-Semite, racist, and It is imperative to keep in mind that Fuentes isn't just some right-wing political commentator. He is a prolific anti-Semite, racist, and white supremacist who routinely promotes Holocaust denialism and race realism. From 2020 to 2021, in 2020 and 2021, Fuentes was banned from most mainstream social media websites, including Facebook, Twitter/X, and YouTube. By May of 2025, however, Twitter/X reinstated his profile, which has now amassed over 1 million followers, affirming his newfound influence in right-wing circles beyond his initial scope. Polarization tends to breed extremism, and opportunists like Fuentes are more than aware of this. By exploiting the changing currents of social media, Fuentes has amassed a plethora of followers and media attention, catapulting him to mainstream recognition. The platforming of Nick Fuentes sets a dangerous precedent and is a prime example of social media's ability to proliferate extremist values. As far as we know, however, his activity on Twitter and his streaming have yet to incite any real-world acts of violent extremism. But what happens when social media activity does correlate with real-world violence? And do we have the tools to prove it for certain? In a previous research paper of mine, titled How Social Media Bolsters Right-Wing Extremism, the case of the January 6th Capitol riots, I focused on the impact of social media in expediting the spread of extreme messages and their correlation with real-world radical and violent action by asking the question, how did the dissemination of extremist views on social media affect the outcome of the Capitol riots? By measuring tweets containing extreme right-wing discourses on Twitter/X, which I used as categorizations for specific buzzwords, I attempted to prove my hypothesis that social media had a significant impact on the occurrence of the January 6th Capitol riots, arguing that many extremist groups and lone actors were influenced to storm the Capitol by the messages they saw on their feed. These discourses were represented by a series of terms relating to right-wing extremist discourse, particularly those concerning events that were the catalyst for the riots, such as allegations of election fraud during the 2020 presidential election. Key buzzwords were categorized into 3 respective dictionaries that represented the primary concerns of alt-right conglomerates and lone actors immediately pre- and post-Capitol riots. These categories included extreme discourse, incitement discourse, and rage discourse. Though notable engagement was found in all 3 discourse categories, overall results were inconclusive, due in part to imposed limitations on Twitter/X's API system at the time. To access Twitter's full archive of tweets, we need access to their, quote, academic research product tract, which required research approval by X themselves. It was highly unlikely Twitter/X was going to sign off on an academic research paper that was seeking to find them liable for inciting extremist violence on their platform. And they didn't. This seems to be a widespread issue in research when observing social media's role in violent extremism, aggravating limitations in collection and differentiations in project data, and limiting the ability to synthesize. This seems to be a widespread issue in research when observing social media's role in violent extremism, which aggravates limitations in collection and differentiation in project data, and limits the ability to synthesize data in a scientific fashion. Thus, most data is limited to surveys and archives from more fringe and slated message boards. While it is difficult to assuredly connect extremist activity on social media to real-world examples of political violence, what is apparent is that social media does, in fact, play a crucial role in disseminating extremist values on a large scale following a significant event of political violence. According to existing research sponsored by the National Institute of Justice, the online dynamics of social media can, in fact, radicalize individuals to the point of violent extremism through various means. Typically, the more, quote, online a person is, the more likely they are to engage with extremist content. Additionally, an individual's characteristics and pre-existing beliefs may impact their susceptibility. For example, according to a study from Arkansas State University, individuals who are white and hold anti-government sentiment were more likely to come across, quote, hateful content online than others, thus leaving them more susceptible to radicalization. Research also shows that individuals are more susceptible to extremist ideology following the aftermath of an instance of political violence, wherein extremists will actively exploit the uproar caused by said incidents. For example, a research report from NYU observing online mobilization and violence in the United States monitored social media platforms following recent acts of political violence. Over a 13-week monitoring period, they observed extensive exploitation of violent incidents by extremist networks across the ideological spectrum. Over a 13-week monitoring period, they observed, quote, extensive exploitation of violent incidents by extremist networks across the ideological spectrum, from far right, far left, violent Islamist groups, and even nihilistic extremists, which were ideologically lacking individuals who enacted criminal acts in terror for the sole purpose of creating social instability. The report found that, quote, far-right actors used the Metcalf stabbing, Zarutska's killing, and the Kirk assassination to advance white victimhood narratives. Far-left networks celebrated the Capitol Jewish Museum shooting and engaged in systematic doxing of law enforcement. Violent Islamist groups maintained a symbolic propaganda presence despite reinforcement. Violent groups maintained a symbolic propaganda presence despite enforcement pressure. Content from NVE motivated, NVE refers to nihilist extremist attackers, circulated after their attacks, glorifying violence for shock value and notoriety. End quote. Since political extremism and violence worsen across the political spectrum, with the inclusion of individuals lacking ideological motives as well, this is a more alarming finding and supports our claim that social media proliferates extremist values, as it seems to be exploited across party lines. So, a lot of information, but not a whole ton of answers today. Although gaps in the research are actively being filled as political polarization gets harder and harder to ignore, it is difficult for researchers to keep up with the rapid rate of social media and its use by extremist actors continues to evolve. I found this to be true in my own attempts at researching this topic, and quickly realized that the scope of the issue was a lot bigger than a singular political science student could tackle on their own. Regardless, I find this to be an exceptionally important issue in today's political climate, and I hope that what you have learned today about how social media interacts with violent extremism will encourage you to be more vigilant about what you consume online. Now more than ever, it is imperative that you are adept in media literacy. It is an essential life skill in this digital age, and you can save yourself, or even a loved one, from falling down the destructive rabbit hole of political extremism. Thank you for listening. This has been Checks and Balances, and we hope to see you next time.